The West African bloc Ecowas says it's ready to launch a military intervention in Niger should diplomatic efforts to reverse a coup there fail. Defence chiefs from the bloc have been meeting in Ghana to address the crisis. Niger's ruling junta has repeatedly defied international efforts to restore President Mohamed Bazoum to office. Last week, Ecowas ordered the deactivation of a standby force for potential deployment in Niger.
Ecowas military leaders are facing a dilemma. Use force and risk regional instability, or back off and allow another West African nation to be under military rule. The bloc leaders have once again emphasized that armed intervention in Niger is a last resort.
Let no one be in doubt that if everything else fails, the valiant forces of West Africa, both the military and the civilian components, are ready to answer to the call of duty. By all means available, constitutional order will be restored in the country. And this meeting today bears testimony to that.
But when and how West African troops could intervene remains unclear. Niger's junta has already ignored an ECOWAS deadline to restore democracy. Meanwhile, the ousted President Mohamed Bazoum and his family are under house arrest in the capital Niamey. ECOWAS have called on the coup leaders to release the president. Yet another demand rejected by Niger's new rulers.
If presidential guards in Guinea and Niger, I'll use the word, take hostage their president, nobody, and let me repeat, nobody in West Africa is safe.
At stake is not only the future of Nigerian democracy, but also the credibility of ECOWAS. And the bloc is running out of time and options to restore constitutional order in Niger.
Now, Ulf Laessing is director of the Sahel Program for Germany's Konrad Adenauer Foundation. He's based in the Malian capital, Bamako, but joins us tonight from Hamburg here in Germany. Ulf, thanks for joining us on the day. Now, the language we heard today from ECOWAS military chiefs was pretty clear. We're going into Niger, they said, but can ECOWAS actually back up their words with action?
Well, I have huge doubts they're able to follow some action, what they're saying. They've been talking for 2 weeks about military intervention, yet this force they want to assemble still exists only on paper. And the putschists, they really had time enough to prepare themselves. You know, all major army units are backing the putschists. So, I mean, I really don't hope that ECOWAS intervening could easily, lead to a situation like in Sudan, where we have basically civil war.
How much time do you think it would actually take to set it up?
I mean, at least a month. I mean, there's member states who talk about committing troops, but, they still have to do so. There's also a coordination issue. You have Nigeria. There's opposition inside Nigeria, but and then they speak English, and the rest of the ECOWAS members are mostly Francophone. So there's a lot of coordination, and, ECOWAS only has experience in conflict zones where they were actually invited. Here they're opposed, so I just don't see it happening.
Right, well, meanwhile, Niger's coup leaders remain pretty defiant. So is the country's army solidly behind them?
I mean, they've made progress, in appointing new commanders from key units, also winning buy-in from the special forces, which were the main counterparts for Western countries, a cooperation partner. That was a surprise they're backing the putschists, but maybe there's one or another unit who's still with Bazoum, but the overwhelming majority is with the putschists, so they're in a very comfortable position, and they know this. That's why they're so defiant.
Right. Well, we've seen now in Niger large gatherings in support of the junta, often with people showing Russian flags too. Does the coup enjoy the backing of most Nigerians?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, the first day there was a protest for Mr. Bazoum, the ousted president. Then we've seen all these Russian flags. I mean, they're basically people, groups pro-Russia distributing these flags. So it's not necessarily support of Russia, but it seems they've been able to mobilize the street by saying these sanctions by Ecowas, they're basically imposed by foreign powers such as France and the West African neighbours. So that has apparently rallied a bit, people behind the putschists.
Right, well, Niger, you were just mentioning there the sanctions. Niger has already been hit by a financial and economic blockade by many of its neighbours. Now Germany's foreign minister is calling for EU sanctions against the coup leaders. Do you think it would be actually effective?
No, I doubt it. We've seen it in Mali a year ago. There were really tough, stiff financial sanctions against the junta for delaying elections, and they managed to use the public anger over the sanctions to mobilize support. And I think this is the same thing what the putschists are going to do. And they will be backed by pro-Russia social media campaigns, disinformation campaigns. So I think there's a good chance sanctions will actually backfire.
Right, well, considering that, do you think Niger's democratically elected and now deposed President Mohamed Bazoum will actually be restored to power anytime soon?
No, I don't think it's too long. It's 3 weeks, almost a month, and he's been under house arrest. Nobody has come to rescue him, no army or police unit. And even if he was reinstalled in an unlikely case of a military intervention, he would be in a very weak position. I mean, he would be basically having been rescued by a foreign nation, and that would immediately, trigger another coup. I think he's gone, and we have to be realistic that the putschists are going to stay.
Right, thank you for your analysis. Ulf Laessing from Germany's Konrad Adenauer Foundation.
Welcome.
Dr. Kabir Adamu is a security analyst and managing director at Beacon Consulting, an enterprise security risk management and intelligence solutions provider in Nigeria's capital, Abuja. Welcome to DW. So have any decisions been reached at this Ecowas meeting regarding the situation in Niger?
Yes, what we are hearing from the venue of the meeting is that the participants, about 11 countries, have committed themselves to a military intervention if it comes to that. In other words, they have endorsed the outcome of an earlier meeting that they had held in Abuja, where they charted out a course of military intervention. So it appears that this is the same thing. There were concerns before the meeting. There was an Ecowas parliament meeting where the members were divided. And so this meeting was more or less an endorsement of that initial decision to go ahead with the military intervention if it comes to it.
Is a military intervention really seen as a viable way of restoring democracy in Niger?
Not necessarily. It is an option. There are several other options being considered. Most of them are diplomatic options. Economic sanctions have been imposed. And from what we're hearing in Niger, the effects of those economic sanctions are being felt at the moment. And I think the intention of ECOWAS member states is that those economic sanctions would lead to a lesser support for the military junta. And if that support reduces, then they may be forced to come to the table to discuss perhaps the reinstatement of President Bazoum.
Let's talk a little bit more about the sanctions. So Germany's foreign ministry is calling for EU sanctions against the coup leaders. Do you think that they would actually be effective?
Well, if there is unison in terms of multilateral bodies and bilateral partners supporting ECOWAS to impose and enforce those sanctions, then yes. Niger is a landlocked country. It is hugely impoverished. It depends on development aid for almost about 40% of its needs. And so where that is cut off, and like I said already, the effect of the economic sanction by ECOWAS alone. Now, if the rest of the world also supports that move and more sanctions are imposed, then the effect would definitely be felt. Now, the junta has been able to control the narrative and make ECOWAS look like the bad friend here. In other words, most Nigerians are not seeing the junta as responsible for the unconstitutional change in government. So I think a combination of the sanctions and then more effort in strategic communication, the type that would redirect this type of thinking so that Nigerians see the unconstitutional change in government. And then, of course, the role of the junta in doing that would probably help achieve that better than the way it's going at the moment.
Right, well, we'll be keeping a close eye on developments there in Niger. Security analyst Dr. Kabir Adamu, thank you for joining us on DW.
Thank you for having me.
Hundreds of trucks are lined up on Niger's closed borders, many filled with desperately needed aid and food. Although sanctions placed on Niger since last month's coup have only been in place for around 2 weeks, the country, one of the poorest in the world, is being hit hard. The majority of its electricity has been cut off by neighboring Nigeria. And food prices are skyrocketing, making life and work even more challenging, fueling anger against Ecowas while growing support for Niger's military leaders.
We don't care about Ecowas. Ecowas has been tailor-made for the presidents in power, and we do not need it. Whether Ecowas intervenes or not, Niger is ready for all options. We're ready.
My children and I love these soldiers. And I invite young people to join the army and develop our country, our villages. I make blessings for these soldiers.
ECOWAS leaders have so far avoided taking military action to remove Niger's new unelected rulers, but have said a standby force could be used. They know an armed conflict could further destabilize the region, something ECOWAS wants to avoid.
Let's get more from our reporter, Tommy Oladipo. Welcome, Tommy. So do you expect this meeting of military chiefs to actually deploy this standby force we just heard about?
They have been instructed by ECOWAS to deploy. So it's a question of what they'll be discussing is what kind of operation they're expected to carry out, how many troops they'll need, what kind of troops they'll need, how long they'll deploy for, how much this is going to cost. So I think that will be the focus of the discussion. And this deployment, as we're calling it, could take some time. I don't expect that it will just be an overnight thing and we see troops showing up. So I think the whole point is for ECOWAS to carry on with a kind of diplomatic process, even though they're instructing the troops to get ready. So we'll see that they'll be trying to buy time. I don't think it's going to be overnight.
Right, and interestingly, the coup does appear to have popular support. Is that likely to last?
Even that question of popular support is difficult to gauge. Yes, we've seen people in the streets. Yes, we've seen the military try to appeal to the public and have these rallies in public, but it's difficult to gauge what percentage of Nigerians actually support this movement, and if the people who are opposed to it can even come out to express themselves and say they're opposed to it. But with the rising food prices, with life getting tougher, with no electricity, it's difficult to say how this will play out long term and whether that will sustain support for them.
Right, so as the sanctions you just mentioned there, as they bite, can Niger expect economic support from neighbouring countries which also are led by military regimes?
We've seen Mali and Burkina Faso in particular come out and express support for the military in Niger. They're also among the poorer West African states. So I don't think they have anything to offer Niger in terms of whether economically. They've said they will support Niger militarily, but even then they are suffering their own jihadi insurgencies at home. So it's difficult to see how that would work out. And practically as well, they wouldn't be able to stand up against Nigeria, Senegal, Ivory Coast, these sort of bigger nations. But I think this is more about an ideological stance they're putting forward and saying they want to be able to govern themselves and not have outsiders impose values on them. OK, so talk us through the diplomatic activity from outside the region, then. Well, we've seen the US is sending in a new ambassador despite the coup. The US has been categorical to mention that they do not recognize the coup. So they don't officially recognize President Bazoum as having been deposed. Having said that, they have, and it's clear because, they have a lot of investment, military investment in Niger. They've supported Niger's troops in counterterrorism. They have American facilities in Niger. That's hundreds of millions of dollars of investment that they do not want to let go, especially they don't want to be seen to be dealing with a non-democratic government. So I think they're trying to have one foot in, but also not be seen to be too overt in exerting pressure, because this is, again, Niger being painted as a case of us versus them, and they don't want to be seen as yet another Western power. We're seeing the negativity towards France. The US doesn't want to be put in that category, so that's why they're letting Ecowas take the front seat. OK, thank you for that, Tommy. Tommy Oladipo. Thank you.